Sourdough is my favorite kind of bread, and I'll tell you why. It's made with wild yeasts, not the dried package yeast you can buy at the grocery store. These wild yeasts are found all around us, including our skin and on the surface of foods like the flour we use in the bread. Flour and water are mixed and left to ferment, that is, multiply these wild yeasts and good bacteria. Because your starter is a living thing, it needs to be fed on a regular basis. You can tell that your starter is hungry when a brownish liquid called hooch is produced. When fed the mixture of flour and water, the wild yeast consumes the malt sugars within the flour and produces two main byproducts, ethanol and carbon dioxide. This hooch is the mild alcohol that forms in yeast's active stage, and it serves as a sign that your starter is ready to be fed. The best method for feeding your starter is a 1:1:1 ratio. For every 50 grams of starter, add 50 grams of unbleached all-purpose flour and 50 grams of water. As living things do, your sourdough starter will continue to grow as you feed it. While many websites suggest you dump excess starter in the trash before each feeding, I prefer to use my starter discard in all kinds of recipes. Stick around to the end of the video to see my favorite and easiest way to enjoy this fermented goodness. I only bake about once a week, so I keep my starter in the fridge. The night before I'm ready to make some bread, I take the starter out, feed it, and leave it in a warm spot overnight. By the next morning, the starter is bubbly, active, and ready to go. Once the starter is active, it's time to bake. This whole baking process takes just about all day, so I find a cup of coffee absolutely necessary to get started. The first thing I do is wipe down my work surface with a food-grade vinegar and water mixture to sanitize it. If we're going to talk about sourdough bread, we have to acknowledge its signature tang. There are many ways to enhance this flavor, many of which have to do with the flour. Whole grain flour, especially rye, will result in a more sour loaf. In this recipe, I use a mixture of rye and buckwheat, as well as unbleached all-purpose flour. Baker's percentages are an easy way to adjust recipes based on scale. For this recipe, I used 850 grams of all-purpose flour, 150 grams of whole grain flours, 700 grams of water, 250 grams of starter, and 20 grams of salt. I'm sure to save some starter so I can continue my sourdough adventure another time. Next, it's time to combine our ingredients. I mix the flour, water, and starter together with my hands, working them to make sure there are no lumps. After those ingredients are combined, I fold in my salt. Next, I turn out my dough onto the workspace and begin to knead. Why is kneading so important, you ask? Well, wheat flours, like the ones that we're using in this recipe, have two proteins, gliadin and glutenin, which combine to form gluten. When the dough is first mixed, these proteins are tangled up in knots with no sense of order. Kneading the dough causes these proteins to line up and form big chains of amino acids, creating a sort of web within the dough. This web is what allows the bread to capture the bubbles of CO2 produced by the yeast, which is what makes such airy, delicious bread. I'm new to the sourdough hobby, and I'm still learning the ropes to a decent loaf. I used two methods to encourage gluten development: basic kneading and something that's called the stretch and fold method, which you can see here. Once the dough is smooth and soaky, I transfer it to a bowl and cover with a damp tea towel. Next, I place the bowl in a warm space to proof, or rise. Here's where my methodology could use some adjustments. Something that I learned while baking this batch was how to balance my kneading methods. I combined 15 minutes of basic hand kneading with the stretch and fold method. Every 30 minutes throughout the first proofing stage, the dough was stretched and folded back on itself. By the time I was ready to bake, my dough was weak and couldn't keep its shape, which wasn't a good sign. What I learned is that my dough was overproofed, which means that all of those beautiful air bubbles I worked so hard to nurture were lost. After some research, I decided that next time I should only knead for 5 minutes instead and stretch and fold every hour instead of every 30 minutes. For the sake of learning, I'll show you every time I folded my dough during the proofing stage. As far as what makes sourdough sour. After it's had a chance to rise for 3 to 4 hours, it's time to shape our dough. First, I grab a proofing bowl to put my dough in once it's shaped. I then flour my work surface as well as a tea towel that's lining that proofing basket. The shaping process does require a bit of practice. The goal of shaping your dough is to use its stretchiness to create tension along the surface of the bowl. This is how we achieve a nicely shaped loaf. Here you can see me stretching and folding the dough down onto itself. This creates surface tension along the bottom. Here you can see me tucking the dough under itself, creating more and more surface tension. After we've shaped the dough, it's time to let it rest and proof for another 3 to 4 hours. Once I've shaped the dough, I carefully transfer it to our lined and floured proofing basket, making sure the bottom of the dough, the seam side, is facing up. I cover the dough with the tea towel and transfer it once again to a warm part of the house to proof for another 3 to 4 hours. When I'm ready to bake, I preheat my Dutch oven at 450 degrees and turn it down to 400 once the bread is in. Here you can see the result of overproofed dough, no structure whatsoever. Thankfully, I was able to quickly fold the dough back onto itself, place it in my Dutch oven, and give it a quick score. When it first goes into the oven, the bread continues to rise. Scoring the dough like this allows it to rise while maintaining its shape. Good, crusty bread needs a very hot environment and steam. Keeping the lid on for the first half of the baking process ensures this. While my bread is baking, let's talk a little bit more about what makes sourdough sour. There are 2 kinds of acid found within sourdough, lactic and acetic. Lactic acid lends a smooth yogurty flavor to the bread, while acetic provides a more sour vinegar-like flavor. If you're trying to enhance the sour acetic acid taste, like I am, it's good to let your starter go hungry from time to time. This way, more hooch builds up, which you can stir back into to promote sourness. And voila! Would you look at that? You'd never guess it was a stretchy mess a mere hour ago. It's okay. It's okay. We can't forget the crunch test. It's really good. Did I tell you air pockets are a good sign? While that cools, let me tell you about a scallion pancake. It's the easiest breakfast ever. Simply pour your starter discard into a hot olive-oiled pan, top with chopped scallions, and cook until the edges are golden brown. Flip and cook another 3 to 4 minutes, and enjoy.